Table Talk friends, and welcome back to this week's Table Talk Tuesday. We're here with Emily Rubel.
Hello.
And David Beatty.
Good to be with you again.
And we are here to answer some of your questions and really to help all of us sort of walk our talk.
Right.
And so let's just get started. The first question I've got, David, I wanted to ask for you.
Okay.
This question is from Mary out in Colfax. She noticed in Romans 4, 9 through 12, and I want to say it's probably just, instead of a specific verse, really the passage, that circumcision was talked about as this outward sign of righteousness that Abraham received by his faith. 10:11, he says he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness. And she says that, this started maybe a light bulb that could the same be said for believers today about baptism. Is there a link between circumcision and baptism? And that's really her question, just kind of.
Yes. Yes, I think the answer is yes.
Yes, okay.
And the scripture passage that's often used to make that link is found in the book of Colossians chapter 2. And we read these words in verses 11 and 12 of Colossians 2. In him also you were circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. This passage is often used to provide a basis for the baptism of infants, because 8-year-olds were circumcised in Abraham's day as a sign of the covenant before faith was present. It's the primary basis, I think, for those who hold that infants should be baptized as a sign of the covenant of their parents. So both are referred to as a sign. And whatever a person believes about baptism, whether it's after you've come to faith or for an infant, either way we do treat it as a sign, because baptism is a sign. The water signifies the washing away of sin, the incoming of the Holy Spirit. So it's a great question, and I think there is a link in that both are considered as a sign.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That does, and I know you've actually put together at one point a teaching on
CD.
Infant baptism and
Yeah.
adult profession of faith or adult baptism, which I think is always very interesting to learn more about. But really, at the heart of covenant theology, I guess, is infant. If you've
It's very different from for example, a Presbyterian church. It's a very different understanding of what happens in baptism than in a Roman Catholic church.
Exactly.
Very different understanding.
That's right.
In a Presbyterian church, it's the application of the sign by faith.
Right. Being brought in under the family through this grace, but not from a salvation standpoint.
Right. Right.
Wow.
Which goes back, we talked about signs a couple weeks ago, that they are not what save, but that they're a sign of the covenant,
Yes.
and circumcision being the old covenant and baptism being the new covenant.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, and I would tell Mary as well, in April, now we've got March equipping classes, but in April, we are actually going to spend 3 weeks on sacraments, creeds, and confessions. And so one full week is going to be on the views of baptism from a biblical standpoint, and then what is in practice. So more to come on this question. But thank you, David.
So thinking about Old Testament realities and then coming into the New Testament, Heidi wanted to know if the term Gentiles means the same thing in the Old and New Testament.
Oh, okay. Paul uses that word a lot. We see it actually, and I was, looking here, I've got it opened, chapter 3, with the end of 3, is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, and on and on and on, the dividing wall of hostility. There's neither Jew nor Greek, in a way, Gentiles. So the 60-second version. We'll get to another 60-second version later. But so the word that Paul's using here is ethnos. People, ethnicity. We kind of get that word out of that. And that word really carried with it mostly the idea of nations or people. In Revelation 21, talks about the light of the city will be a light to the nations. Ethnos, same word. 1 Peter talks about you're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, ethnos. But on occasion, it's also used to distinguish those who are not Jewish. Mm-hmm. And that's when we would see the English Gentile. So same word. In the Old Testament, the word is goy. We would transcribe it as G-O-Y. Goy. Same thing. Nations, people, but also when used of those who are not Jewish, goy, Gentiles. So the short answer is yes. Gentiles would be considered the same from the Old Testament, New Testament. If you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. Even if you converted in first century to a Christian, or in Judaism, you were a God-fearer, that we see that language in here, but you were still a Gentile. There's Genesis 10, dividing up the lands and the tribes, the King James Version. This is like a little bonus part. I'm sorry, 65 seconds. The King James Version has transcribed it or translated it as Gentiles there, and that has confused some people because it seems like just a select number of people are called Gentiles. Gentiles, Genesis 10, it's like 5 or so. This is good. I should have had something marked here. And this is important, though. Yeah. From those, the coastland, and King James says, Gentiles spread in their lands, each with its own language, clans, and nations. And some will say, well, those are the Gentiles. Everyone else he lists after that are not. Mm-hmm. That would be what seems to be, from all the other translations, an inaccuracy to actually what that translated word should be. That should still be coastline peoples or nations. Mm-hmm. All that to say, I think her question was, does it make a difference? How does it affect us? And I think it does make a difference that all non-Jews from creation forward were considered Gentiles. And Paul says now that through the righteousness of God, through the dividing wall of hostility being torn down, through the fact that there is no Jew or Greek, this is the language of one body, of unity. When the promise of Abraham to all nations, all people, that means everybody. Mm-hmm. So when he's covering Gentiles, that means everyone who was not an Israelite or Hebrew or a Jew. Mm-hmm. And that's a great understanding. So it does make a difference that it's everybody else has been brought in under this new covenant of Jesus' blood. That's a long way around, but does that make sense, David, to you? Or?
I think so. I think Heidi, it's a good question, but I think generally speaking we can understand the same in Old and New Testament for the most part. I think that's what she's asking.
Yeah, and I think what she was getting was the language in Romans. That, we're seeing this with Abraham, and he's the father of all nations. Does that mean all Gentiles? And is that the same, or just certain ones considered Gentiles? Or?
Well, I actually wondered if Heidi was thinking about the verse I used in Galatians. Because I don't think he used Gentiles in Romans 4, but he did in Galatians 3. And the word you mentioned, the ethne, is translated both Gentiles and nations in the same verse there.
Yes,
so they're, I think, the same.
By context.
Right. But Emily, for you, a question, defining faith is really important. Mm-hmm. And Doug asked a great question yesterday. He asked us to explain the difference between believing in God and believing God. What role do these have to play in establishing our faith? What's the difference in believing in God and believing God?
Mm-hmm. That is a great question. I think kind of what Doug might be getting at is believing in God makes me think of what you talked about in your sermon of what faith is. Sometimes we can think, or there's quotes out there that it's just this vague, like, feeling of, well, I hope things turn out well. And I think people can do that with a faith or with a belief in God, of a belief in a higher power or a belief in something out there. And the author of Hebrews tells us that it is important that we do believe that God exists. And so that belief in something being out there, namely God being out there, is important. But there seems to be, the Bible gives us a better picture of what belief is, that it's not just this intellectual understanding of a God, it is a personal relationship with the God, like the living and true God. And so it requires trust.
Yes.
And Romans touches on this. You really, I think, just dove into it of it's not just knowledge about God, but it's a knowledge that is personal. And so I think just maybe another helpful picture is when we think about like trust falls. You can say that I believe that you're gonna like catch me if I fall back into your arms, but I don't really believe that you are gonna catch me until I like take the weight off of my legs and fall back. And I think that's closer to what believing God is. It is necessarily something that we act in, that we trust God.
Anything you would add to that, David?
Yeah, so this week in the study guide, Emily, I was working through it myself for my group. Great questions around like defining, these certain words and faith, belief. Just kind of really think about, and you just keep coming around to like complete confidence, complete trust, so when I think about this, I think that establishing our faith, that really the importance is, yes, believing in God has to happen. But James 2:19, he says even the demons believe that God is one. So that's certainly not enough. And so once we believe, confess, believe, we then have to demonstrate the complete confidence. And so I think that's the walking in faith. But it's
So it's not mere intellectual assent. It's not merely believing in God. Demons believe in God, but it's trusting God, believing in Him, but more, placing our trust in Him. And in Romans, in particular, the salvation He's provided through Jesus in His death and resurrection.
To trust in that,
Right.
So David, as we think about faith, that was all that your sermon was about, was a faith like Abraham. So what would you say is the big idea that we can learn from that?
I think if there's one central idea that I hope would have been conveyed about faith in Romans, it would come from verse 16, where Paul writes, "That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace." It's necessary that Abraham was saved by faith and that we be saved by faith, because our faith rests upon grace. It's not faith in our faith. It's not faith in our ability to be good enough or to do enough. It's faith in the giver, in God, and in His grace. So faith that rests on grace, the promise of God.
How about you?
I think what really stuck out to me was that the strength of our faith comes from the object of it rather than like our own strength to believe, that we don't have to like fret over, do I have enough faith to be saved? It's like, do I have faith in the one that saves? That's what saves me, not necessarily the strength of what I believe or the strength that I have in myself.
Yeah.
What about you, David?
Well, I saw the progression there in my mind as you were talking through that, David, was like Abraham, with genuine saving faith, we receive grace, we are counted righteous, and we are moved to walk in Him and with Him.
That's good.
And sort of that progression of that. So, but, it's good word. And as we walk in that faith, we share that faith. And so for our gospel sharing moment here to wrap up this week, last week, we did the 60-second testimony. And I think just a little more clarity on that, David. You weren't here, but you've seen this in Journey, right? The 60-second, this is life before, this is how I changed, this is what's changed in me after. And just as clarity, this, I'll talk to you guys at home, this does not take the place of providing the full picture of the gospel, the complete. That has to be that has to be part of it. This does not take the place of sharing a life story, or this is something we have that at any moment, just by any sort of opportunity, and there are many, if we listen, that we can share this in a way that draws out more questions, that gets someone's interest, and we're so ready with it that we want someone to know.
Yeah.
How did I come to faith? And what has it meant to me? How has it changed me? If you'd like to know more, let's talk.
Yeah.
Or it's just it's one of the tools. So this week, Emily is going to share her 60-second testimony.
So I grew up actually in Kids Rock for a couple years and really learned a little bit about God and the Bible and like what Christianity was about. But as I grew up, I actually had started going to a different church, but things as to like my sin and my suffering, I couldn't see the connection between like who God was and who I was, and so kind of just wandered through life trying to be God to myself, trying to figure out what was good and right and true, and tried to like define what I thought God wanted from me. But I found myself falling into sin and guilt, and wasn't sure like if God demanded perfection, I definitely saw that I couldn't make it happen in myself, and so I was really frustrated. But it was my freshman year of college. Some girls befriended me, and they shared the gospel with me that it wasn't really up to me to save myself, and that I couldn't, that my guilt could be brought to the cross, and that it would be dealt with, that my sin would be dealt with, and that I could be forgiven and free. And so I'd say that's when I put my faith in Jesus, was that year. And then after that, it was that freedom of walking in grace rather than walking in trying to fix myself or trying to make myself do what I thought God wanted. It was a resting in His grace.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
And thank you all for joining us. Continue to email your questions, and next week, pull up a chair for Table Talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll hear your testimony next week.
Oh, okay.
How's that?
All right,
good?
good.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Very good.